Yeah, welcome to the Symposium Memory for Serial Order Theory and Applications. We have four interesting presentations, I believe. Just maybe a few practical things. The most important being how are we going to deal with questions. We're not going to accept questions during the talk because that would be too confusing. Instead, you are allowed to, or you are invited to push the hand raising icon, and then you come on a list of people who asked questions, and then in the time we have available, the speaker can respond to your questions, or you can also send chat messages as an alternative. I'm going to try to keep people on the time schedule. So if you see me waving, that means that the speaker, the end of his 15 minutes is approaching, and then we have 5 minutes for every talk, for questions. So I now ask Giulia Cristoforetti from Ghent University to put her presentation online to share her screen for a presentation, the neural substrate of serial order coding in working memory.
Okay, so I hope everyone can see my screen actually. So I am Giulia Cristoforetti. I am a PhD student at the University of Ghent. Today I'm going to present you an fMRI study investigating ordinal structure in working memory. So serial order, coding serial order is a fundamental feature of working memory. Without the ability to maintain serial order across items in working memory, for example, it would be a tremendously effortful job to calculate the overall prices of all your purchase in a shop, or to make a decent sandwich, or rather to construct a line of reasoning. So actually, how do we represent serial order information in memory? So whenever we have to remember items in a sequence, we would represent them on a mental whiteboard, in a strong analogy to writing information on a physical whiteboard for consultation. Similarly to its external consultation, in order to select and retrieve items from a sequence, we would move our putative searchlight of attention across items. So behavioral studies actually have shown that indeed serial order in verbal working memory is grounded in the spatial attention system. So serial order is spatially coded along an orderly dimension, for example, from left to right. Notably, this spatial coding occurred spontaneously in verbal working memory, which is actually lacking of any spatial information. So items at the beginning of a sequence are linked to the left side of the space, and end items to the right side of the space. Finally, internal spatial attention is involved in searching through the serial order representation. So this process has been studied mainly with this paradigm, which is divided in 3 different phases. So in the phase 1, participants are asked to encode a sequence of items presented serially at the center of the screen. After a retention interval, they are instructed to compute a go-no-go-Posner queuing task. Instead of having an arrow pointing to the right or to the left, there will be a number, a digit, an item that is part or not part of the sequence. If this digit is part of the sequence, they are instructed to detect a dot that can appear on the left or the right side of the screen as fast as possible. In the third phase, it is a verification task in order to make sure that participants are actually maintaining the correct order of the items. Behaviorally, it has been shown that the later the item in a sequence, the faster the response to detect the target on the right side. So this is showing a shift of attention across items. Finally, this order, we can say that order produces spatial biases. It has also been shown that working memory position and dot location are independent from queue magnitude. In terms of neural substrate, the intraparietal sulcus has been constantly linked to each of the crucial features of serial order in working memory: verbal working memory, serial order processing, and spatial selective attention. Specifically, whereas more posterior and middle part of the IPS has been involved in selective attention and the integration of top-down and bottom-up attentional system, the anterior intraparietal sulcus is mainly involved also in serial order coding. It has been observed also consistently stronger right activation of the IPS for order than for identity information. Instead, the left intraparietal sulcus is involved both in order processing and also identity information, but is functionally linked to the right IPS for order retention. Another region, here we actually propose that the IPS is involved in the integration between serial order coding in working memory and the spatial attention system. Another region that is involved in serial order working memory is the hippocampus. Till now, the hippocampus has been mainly studied in the spatial navigation and spatial memory, but recently there are evidence which show that it preserves the temporal order of events. Indeed, besides place cells, also contains cells that specifically code for time. It has also been shown that it is involved in pattern separation as the ability to distinguish among the similar items or events in memory. So now we can start talking about the aim of our experiment, which was to actually decode brain regions that can decode a serial order in working memory. We are interested in this, like investigating region that can decode beginning versus end of a sequence. We use the technique of multivoxel pattern analysis on fMRI data acquired when retrieving serially stored items. We used numbers, digits, in order to disentangle and further investigate position and number magnitude effect. So the paradigm used is the same one that I just described before. We collected data of 28 participants, and we were mainly interested in the time where participants are actually retrieving items from the memory sequence. So they have to encode a sequence serially presented. They have to compute a go-no-go Posner queuing task, and we will look at the activity after the retrieval of an item that is part of the sequence. We determined the accuracy of a binary support vector machine, and we decoded the order, differentiating between beginning and end of the retrieved items of a sequence. We decoded the magnitude, differentiating between small and large magnitude of the digit retrieved. And we had a priori hypothesis, and we used a region of interest approach, investigating the anterior IPS, the posterior IPS, and also the hippocampus. In terms of results, a classifier was trained to distinguish between the first and the fourth position in the intraparietal sulcus. Significance classification accuracy was assessed at the group level by comparing the distribution of classification accuracy to a chance level distribution. It is clearly shown that the anterior IPS in both the hemisphere can decode order, so differentiating between the first position and the last position of an item retrieved. Moreover, also the posterior IPS in the left hemisphere. This is in line with actually our hypothesis in relation to decoding in the IPS. There is no decoding of in the IPS for the magnitude, so there is no classification between small and large magnitude in the IPS. In the hippocampus, we have a similar result as in the IPS. So we obtain that the hippocampus, the left hippocampus, can decode between order positions, comparing first and end position. Further analysis will be computed in order to differentiate different regions of the hippocampus. Mainly, we don't have a priori hypothesis if the classification happen mainly in the anterior and the posterior part. So further analysis will be computed. In conclusion, from this experiment, from this study, we obtained that the anterior IPS and the left posterior IPS decodes ordinal structure irrespective on the magnitude. So these are evidence of the role of the IPS, which is involved in serial order and spatial processing, and it is consistent with the working memory account of spatial coding in serial order working memory, which is actually linking spatial processing and serial order. Additionally, we had evidences in the role of the hippocampus in decoding ordinal structure, which preserves the temporal order of items in a sequence, and it is again consistent with the working memory account. So here we propose that the working memory might be the convergence point of both space and time. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer to any question.
Okay, thank you, Julia, for this interesting and well-presented presentation. Are there questions from the audience? Then, if so, please push the raise hand button. And then normally we should see this.
Wim Gevers just asked the question.
Ah, yeah, okay. Yeah, Wim Gevers.
Yes, Wim Gevers. Do we put on the screen when we ask a question or not?
Yes, I think that's most convenient.
Okay. Hi, Julia.
Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. I have two questions actually. Do you have, one is more on why you chose to only identify the first and the last position in the sequence, because whether this is really reflecting, I was just wondering whether this is really reflecting fine-grained ordinal information. I understand that in the first phase that you want to take the extremes to be that you can go as forward as much as you can with this, but whether there are then plans also to have like a more continuous idea of coding of the ordinal positions. Mm-hmm. And then the second question is whether you have an idea or whether you have an idea and or there are plans to continue to see more directly how the hippocampus and the IPS would work together to accomplish this.
Thank you for the questions. So in terms of middle position, my colleague Vezal already looked at the middle position in his study, and actually we can see that there is this specialization. There is this linear specialization, but actually in my fMRI study, I didn't look into details because of number of trials and the timing of my fMRI, but for sure at the moment I just decided to look at the two extremes, but in further analysis I will for sure have a look at the middle region, but mainly also in terms of number of trials. As an fMRI study, it was not possible to compute really differentiated, but of course we will differentiate between begin, end and middle positions. So the two positions in the middle will be one single category. I could, but there will be. Okay. And yes, indeed, it would be interesting to also do some type of a correlational analysis to see also on functional collectivity, but I am still at the beginning of this analysis. So, but indeed it would be really interesting. So to look at a connectivity between them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? We still have time. I have maybe one question. With respect to the hippocampus, you see that it is clearly the left hippocampus.
Yes.
Is there an explanation why it is the left the left hippocampus that contributes, or?
Yes, we can hypothesize that the left hemisphere is more related to verbal, so there should be some type of lateralization in terms of verbal information. So this is can be an explanation, actually. Yes.
Other questions?
Yes.
Jean-Philippe has a question.
Hi, Julia. Was indeed a very clear presentation. I had one question. I don't know whether it is possible to investigate this with fMRI, but typically you see that begin items shift attention towards the left and items towards the right. Maybe not necessarily in this detection paradigm, but with left and right hand responses you see. And if I remember from Film Results EEG study, you can also find something like that. Do you find hemispheric differences that the right hemisphere is more involved in the retrieval of begin items and the left hemisphere more in the retrieval of the end items, according to attentional, that is the direction of the attention shift? Or is it just the two hemispheres that contribute to both begin and end items?
So in my opinion, it is should be both hemispheres that are actually involved somehow. There is a lateralization, but mainly in previous, there is, in my opinion, there is a shared representation of this information between hemispheres. So that's why we have an activation in both hemispheres. What I can say is that maybe what we can expect is a lateralization mainly also in the occipital areas. So a representation of the beginning item, I would expect to see a differences maybe in the presentation. The occipital has a connection of the mental representation. So maybe in this type of areas. Otherwise, in the IPS, I think it is more like a shared representation. Mm-hmm. But this is something that we should investigate, indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
One last question. If not, then we proceed to the next speaker. So I give not the floor, but the screen to Steve Majerus, who will introduce us in the developmental neural substrate of serial order learning.
Can you hear me, see me? Yes, okay.
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I will continue this symposium on addressing now the long-term memory aspects of serial order coding and processing that has already been mentioned by Julia. Okay, I have some difficulties in planting my slides, and now it's working. So many aspects of our cognitive system are determined by serial order knowledge and sequential knowledge. For example, a very good example is the language system, which is composed of many types of representations that involve serial order information, such as phoneme order in word forms, such as consonant and vowel order in syllable structures, such as co-occurrence probabilities that determine phoneme co-occurrences in auditory words, or grapheme co-occurrences in written words. The question I am addressing in this talk is partly related to the mechanisms that allow us to learn these long-term serial order representations. One form of memory we already have seen that contributes to this learning, but which does not itself define the learning process, is serial order working memory. A number of studies have shown that serial order working memory supports learning of sequential knowledge of serial order representations in long-term memory. However, serial order working memory is a temporary memory system, so it's not related to the learning process directly. The learning process directly has been defined by different kinds of studies which have identified different kinds of long-term serial order processes. And among the most well-known long-term serial order learning process is the HEP learning process. HEP learning is basically sequential learning by repetition as defined by Donald Hebb in 1949. HEP learning, as probably most of you know, is measured very simply, very easily by presenting, for example, digit lists which are repeated. Not all the lists are repeated, some lists are repeated, and they are presented mixed with random digit lists. And what you typically see in this kind of experiments is that for the repeating lists, recall performance progressively increases, as you see here from this figure I took from a work by Klaus Oberauer. For repeating lists, that is for HEP lists, you show progressive increase in recall performance, while for the random digit lists, performance remains quite stable. The question I will address in this talk is, what is the nature of this serial order learning process? There's a strong opinion in the literature that this learning process should be implicit, should be procedural, because participants typically are not aware of the repetition of the lists, and nevertheless they show quite reliable learning performance. And it has even been shown, even if there are very, very few studies of this kind, but it has been shown in a few neuropsychological studies that patients with episodic memory deficits, with medial temporal lobe lesions, also show HEP learning. This data has been considered to support the implicit procedural learning hypothesis of long-term serial order learning. However, this hypothesis has been recently put into doubt by a neuroimaging study by Christoph Kalm and Dennis Norris in 2013. Actually, it was one of the first studies involving exploring HEP learning with a neuroimaging method. And this study showed that one of the most specific regions associated with HEP learning was actually a part of the anterior hippocampus. This led the authors to suggest that HEP learning actually also involves, well, obviously medial temporal lobe regions and possibly therefore also episodic memory mechanisms. This debate has also been going on in the developmental literature in studies exploring HEP learning performance in children populations, with some studies suggesting that there are no age effects for HEP learning, that HEP learning performance stabilizes very early during development because it would be related to implicit procedural learning processes which are mature at a quite early age. Other studies seem to suggest that there can be age effects also for HEP learning, favoring also the hypothesis that there might be an episodic memory contribution to HEP learning performance. The aim of the study I will present today is to re-explore this question of the type of mechanisms, episodic rather implicit procedural learning mechanisms involved in HEP learning by conducting also a neuroimaging study, and this precisely in a children population. The aim is first to show whether we can replicate the hippocampal involvement in HEP learning in a children population, and then critically, will we observe age effects for this hippocampal involvement? If we show age effects in hippocampal activity related to HEP learning, then this would favor more the episodic memory account, because it is well known that hippocampal activity changes as a function of age in children. On the other hand, if hippocampal activity remains quite stable across development, this would be more in line with a procedural learning hypothesis, given that procedural learning abilities are considered to be mature very early and to show very small developmental changes. What did we precisely do in these studies? We had 49 children aged 6 to 12 years. In the scanner, they were presented a typical HEP learning task using non-word syllables. There were 3 HEP lists, which each were repeated 8 times, and the HEP lists were presented mixed with 24 filler lists. There is one example of the HEP lists, for example, loup, rat, mot, whoopie. Loup, rat, mot, whoopie was repeated 8 times, mixed with random syllable lists. Importantly, the random, which we also call filler lists, contained the same syllables as the HEP lists. Critically, the difference between the HEP lists and the filler list was that in the HEP list, all the syllables all the time always occurred exactly in the same order, while the syllables were presented in random order in the filler list. So this paradigm is really optimized for assessing serial order learning within a HEP learning task and not just some general learning of syllable information. Out of the scanner, we also administer general language tasks like vocabulary knowledge and reading measures. I will come back to these measures in a few moments. What did we observe? First, at the behavioral level, we observed a quite reliable HEP learning effect, as already shown in many different studies. Here in this first figure, you see the progressive increase of recall performance for the HEP list as a function of their repetition, while performance remains quite stable for the filler lists. Very importantly, we didn't observe any reliable modulation by age of the HEP learning effect. We considered different measures. We considered work performance on HEP list versus filler list. We considered learning slopes. And with all the different measures we used, we did not observe reliable modulation of age effects. So these results, yes, rather seem to support different sets of studies which already showed that HEP learning is not so much characterized by age effects, even as I already said, a few other studies observed such age effects. In this study, we didn't get any reliable evidence for age effects. What do we observe at the neuroimaging level? Well, at the neuroimaging level, we very nicely replicate the results observed by Kalm and Norris in adults by observing bilateral hippocampal involvement in the HEP learning process. And this involvement was in regions very similar to those also identified by Kalm and Norris in adults. So we basically replicate here this hippocampal involvement in HEP learning. But again, very importantly, there was no reliable modulation by age of this hippocampal activity in the HEP learning effects. So the hippocampal activity appeared to characterize both very young and older children, and this activity did not change across development, at least did not change across the age range that we studied in this study, that is children aged between 6 and 12 years of age. Despite this lack of correlation with age, this hippocampal activity was actually related to other domains which are involved with serial order learning, such as the acquisition of reading abilities. As I already mentioned in my introduction, many domains in the language domain are characterized by sequential knowledge, where the acquisition of sequential knowledge and reading performance is a very good example of this aspect, where children have to learn to read sequences of graphemes and to associate with their corresponding phonological sequences. And what we observe is that independently of age, the hippocampal involvement in the HEP learning process very nicely correlates with the behavioral, with word reading abilities, both regular word reading abilities and irregular word reading abilities. So what can we conclude from these studies? Well, this is the second study showing clear medial temporal lobe involvement in HEP learning. So in contradiction to a pure procedural hypothesis of HEP learning, which would suggest that HEP learning is mediated by procedural mechanisms in subcortical, sensory motor areas. Here we observe very clearly also medial temporal lobe involvement in regions very similar that already have been identified in adults. Importantly, this medial temporal lobe involvement is not modulated by age. And so, given this absence of age effect in our children population, this would rather contradict an episodic learning account. But then, what could be the role of this hippocampal involvement in HEP learning? As Julia already mentioned in her talk, well, hippocampal cells have been associated with coding of temporal order information and more general serial order information. And other studies have suggested that this coding might indeed be implicit, that is being outside the awareness of the participants. Actually, there would be two different regions in the hippocampus. More anterior regions that would be associated with more implicit serial order coding processes, and more posterior regions that would be associated with the more typically episodic event learning task associated with episodic memory. And actually, the area we observe in the studies, and which Kalman is also observed in their study, is more associated with the anterior hippocampus, which has been associated with the implicit coding of serial order and temporal order information. Also, it's very interesting to know that from neuroanatomical studies, we know that actually anterior hippocampus seems to show a relative decrease of group meta cross development, while the posterior hippocampus, more involved in episodic learning processes, shows actually increases in gray matter structure during an involvement. Again, consistent with age effects that are observed at the behavior level also for episodic memory tasks, but much less for procedural learning tasks, as we assume that these processes are involved in HEP learning. Very importantly, independently of these age effects, we observe here that the serial order learning abilities as measured by the HEP effect and their hippocampal neural substrates are importantly associated with language learning abilities, and more specifically, as we show in the present case, with reading learning abilities. So, to conclude, I would like to thank my collaborators on these studies. First of all, Lucy Atou, who did all the hard work behind the study I presented here, and Lucy Atou from the University of Liège, and then also my colleagues Laura Ordonez-Magro and Arnaud Smalek from UC Louvain. This project was actually a collaboration between the University of Liège and UC Louvain in the context of a PDR project sponsored by the FNRS. I thank you for your attention, and I hope that you were able to follow my talk, because I just got the message that my connection would be poor, but you will tell me whether you got all the information. I hope it was the case.
Thank you, Steve, for the nice presentation. I didn't experience any connections problems, so I could hear and see you clearly. So on that point, no problem. Questions? Please raise your hand if you have some. Maybe I can, there's a question. But I have to find it in the list.
Jean-Philippe.
Jean-Philippe.
Yes. I was wondering whether the children were aware of the HEP lists, because if you have a kind of awareness, then it becomes an episodic memory trace, no?
Yeah. Well, given that the syllables were all the same in both filler list and HEP list, this very strongly reduced the likelihood that the children would have become aware of the syllables. The problem is when you ask very young children whether they are really aware or not of the sequence, this can be a very difficult answer. So we do not really have a reliable measure of the fact whether they were aware of the repetition or not. But the fact that we use the same syllables in both the repeating and non-repeating sequences should have reduced the possibility of becoming aware of the repetition. But in other studies, it has been clearly shown that even when you very reliably measure the level of awareness for HEP repetition, in most cases participants are not aware of the repetition, and despite the fact show quite reliable HEP learning effects.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Question by Frank van Overwallen.
Hi Steve, thank you for your talk. I have a question concerning the cerebellum. Did you see any activation in the cerebellum that contributed to the learning of the list?
Yeah, thanks Frank for your question. No, actually, well, we observed general cerebellar contribution to both filler list and HEP list repetition performance, but specifically for the HEP learning process, we did not observe any hippocampal involvement. We did observe additional insular involvement, but not cerebellar.
Did you find cerebellar activation at what location, more or less, was it?
Cerebellum, it's usually in the right cerebellum, in the superior part of the right cerebellum.
Okay, thank you.
There's time for more questions. I have one question. I was wondering about intraparietal sulcus. Was there any sign of its involvement?
Well, what we observed, we observed general intraparietal sulcus involvement for repetition performance for both filler and HEP lists. And for, as we would expect indeed, because we do not consider that IPS is really related to long-term learning of serial order information. IPS would be involved in temporal representation of serial order information, but this is the same for filler and HEP lists. The difference between HEP and filler lists is that for HEP lists, you can progressively install a long-term memory representations, which we assume indeed would be more related to long-term memory substrates, either in sensorimotor cortices, language cortices, or the hippocampus. Now what we observed, yes, we observed general IPS involvement for both filler and HEP lists, and very interestingly, this involvement was related to age. So this IPS activity increased with age for repetition performance in both HEP and filler lists.
Okay, thank you. I see that there is a question from the chat from François Ndikunguye, and he asks, what can you tell about the primacy and recency effect on this list of words that you used?
Well, this experiment was not designed to specifically assess primacy and recency effects. Generally, of course, you would observe general primacy and recency effects as is called for any immediate theory recall task, both HEP and filler lists, of course. But what we were interested in here in this study was the general increase of recall performance over all serial positions as a function of the repetition of the same lists.
Okay, so it's time to move on to the next speaker. Thank you, Steve. The next speaker is Vezal Razulzadeh from Ghent University. So you can share your screen, Vezal.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, everything is
Can
fine.
you see my screen? Okay. So I'm a third-year PhD student working in Wim Via's lab at UGent, and today the title of my talk is going to be Reading Direction Influences Order Processing in Verbal Working Memory. In previous studies from our lab, it was shown that serially presented information to be kept in working memory are specially coded in our mental or inner mental space from left to right. If we consider that this is the screen where the stimuli are going to be presented, a centrally presented sequence of items is going to be spatially coded from left to right, and this specialization from left to right is manifested in left-hand response facilitation for the beginning item from the sequence and right-hand response facilitation for the later items from the sequence. In another study by Guida et al., it was shown that specialization in working memory is related to reading direction. Basically, they asked participants to memorize a random sequence of color patches, and then they showed a probe color patch. Participants were supposed to say if the color patch, the probe color patch, was from the sequence or not with pressing a left key or a right key. They test these experiments over three groups of people. First, Western left to right readers, second, Arabic right to left readers, and then Arabic illiterates. What they found is that Western left to right readers mentally organize the sequential information from left to right. Arabic right to left readers do it in the opposite way, like from right to left. And Arabic illiterates didn't show any systematic spatial organization. In another study from our lab, it was shown that attentional processes are involved in serial order working memory. Actually, a Posner queuing paradigm, as Julia has already mentioned, was used to show the involvement of spatial processes in serial order working memory. This is the design of the experiment. It has three phases. In the first phase, 4 items, specifically 4 digits, were presented at the center of the screen without any special aspects. And participants were supposed to learn the sequence and keep it in their working memories. In the second phase, after a fixation period, a digit appeared on the screen. It could be one of the items in the sequence or not. If it was one of the items in the sequence, it is a go trial, and participants are supposed to press a button as soon as they detect a target on right or left side of the screen. If this digit is not one of the items in the sequence on no-go trials, participants are not supposed to do anything. This was phase 2 was repeated quite a couple of times, and then in phase 3, 3 questions were asked to make sure participants can maintain the order of the sequence correctly in their working memory. The main focus was on this stage, where we select information from serial order working memory. The idea is that if the beginning items from the sequence is selected or retrieved, it drives our attentions toward the left, and it should be easier to detect targets on the left side of the screen. If later items from the sequence are retrieved, it should drive our attentions toward the right, and it should be easier to detect targets on right side of the screen. And here is what they have found. On x-axis, we have working memory position from 1 to 4, and on y-axis, we have reaction time to right targets minus left targets. We can see this decreasing pattern here, which shows that retrieving later items from the sequence drives our attention towards right and makes it easier to detect right side targets. In this study, we use the same exact paradigm, the Posner queuing paradigm, and we asked Iranian participants to do the same exact experiment with different stimuli. This time, instead of digits, we used Persian letters. And we expected to see the opposite pattern of decoding. So let's say if 4 items are presented over time, we expect to see a right to left coding of these items. Then again, we focused on this retrieval or selection interval, and we expect to see the opposite attention, the opposite specialization of the serial information and operation of the attentional processes on this special organization. Here is what we have found. So this is the exact plot as we have already seen in the previous slide. This time we can show that the decreasing slope there is now increasing, which shows the opposite pattern of specialization in Iranian participants with right to left reading direction. To be able to study the attentional processes that are working on this right to left special organization, we collected EEG data while participants were performing the task. There are 3 main ERP components in the literature that are introduced as the signature of the special attention, namely EDON, ODON, and LDAP components. EDON component is an early component usually observed at occipitoparietal areas. It occurs between 200 and 400 milliseconds after cue onset and is characterized by larger negativity in contralateral versus ipsilateral condition. The second component is ODON component. It's an anterior component. It is usually observed between 300 to 500 milliseconds after cue onset, and it is also characterized by larger negativity in contralateral versus ipsilateral component. LDAP is also observed at posterior sides of the brain, and it is a bit of a late component. It is observed after 500 milliseconds. I took these figures from Ranzini et al.'s study. They showed arrows to participants, and they have identified these EDON and ODON components as the neural indication of the spatial shift of attention, which is induced in response to showing these arrows, which induce shifts of attention in physical or external space. And here is how we studied EDON component. We use 5 clusters, 5 pairs of electrodes at occipitoparietal areas of the brain, and then we group the first 2 items in the sequence, call them as the beginning group. We group the last 2 items in the sequence, call them the end cluster, and then define the ipsilateral condition as the activity of the right hemisphere for the beginning of the sequence and activity of the left hemisphere for the end items in the sequence. And we define the contralateral condition as the activity of the left hemisphere for the beginning items in the sequence and activity of the right hemisphere for the end items from the sequence. A cluster-based permutation test over these 5 pairs of electrodes within the expected interval of EDON and EDON, meaning from 200 to 400 milliseconds, validated the existence of EDON component at 2 pairs of electrodes, namely PO3, PO4 and P3, P4. These EDON components are mainly, we can say that on average is presented between 220 to 300 milliseconds after cue onset. And if we look at the topographical presentation of the beginning minus end, we can see this nice lateralized activity over the posterior areas. To study ODON component, we focused on frontocentral electrodes. We chose 5 pairs of electrodes at this area. We defined ipsilateral and contralateral conditions in the exact same way as EDON component, and a cluster-based permutation test approved existence of ODON at F7, F8 cluster of electrodes between 300 to 380 milliseconds after cue onset. If you look at the topographical presentation of beginning minus end, you can see that the lateralization at the posterior areas are now less expressed and now more visible at more anterior regions. So here we showed we provide neural evidence, or we found the neural indication for the attentional processes that are working on this right to left organization of the items in serial order working memory in Iranian participants. To discuss our results, I would say Iranian participants, as people who write and read from right to left, code serially presented verbal information from right to left in their internal mental space. And selecting information from this serial working memory is accompanied by the special shifts of attention with respect to the items in the sequence, namely beginning items drives the attention towards the right and items drives the attention to the left. Importantly, we found the neural indication of these attentional processes in EDAN and ADAN ERP components. Importantly and interestingly, these components are very similar to the ones that one can observe for external and physical special cues like arrows. As learning to read relies vastly on sequential decoding activities to fulfill phonological decoding and rehearsal mechanism, it is hypothesized to influence the maintenance of the serial information. In line with this hypothesis, our findings provide neural evidence for the influence of literacy on sequential information on sequential coding processes that are involved in serial order working memory. Take-home messages, I would say, maintenance of the sequential information in verbal working memory relies on its spatial organization. Upon selection of information from serial order working memory, attentional processes operate on this internal mental space, and formation of this internal mental space relies on literacy and reading or writing direction. Findings suggest that important aspects of our cognition, like maintenance of serial order information, are influenced by formal educational literacy, and established results from a population with a specific reading direction shouldn't be generalized to all human beings. Thank you so much for listening to me, and if there is any question, I would be happy to discuss.
Thank you, Faisal, for reporting on your interesting results. Questions? Please raise your hands. I see a hand by Wim Jevers. Wim?
Hi, Faisal. Hey, I have a question, and it's really a question I was wondering a bit about, and I don't know, maybe it's not an easy question to answer, but I was wondering if you have your results and you think about the literature, then, I mean, we quite know that there is this link between spatial coding and that language influences, that there are cultural influences on this spatial association. I was wondering what your data really bring as a novelty, what is ADAN and LDAP that you find, which is really interesting that you can solidify it somewhere using the EEG, but what it really adds to this on top of what we know theoretically.
I would say, first of all, this is the first neural indication for this opposite direction of the right to left decoding of the serial information in Iranian participants. So it has its own novelty. And then also the involved attentional processes on this, in selecting items from this special organization in the brain are also, I think it's the first time that they have been established and studied in right to left culture, yes, right to left cultures.
There's a second question from Martin Edwards this time. Martin?
Okay, thank you. This was a really nice talk and really nice presentation of the dissociation. My question is really about whether you would get a similar type of effect if you take, for example, I mean, it is a crazy question, I think, but if you take people, for example, who are older versus younger, And they're used to reading and writing with a small visual angle. So, for example, people that are working on a piece of paper, for example, as their primary media or something like this, versus people working on a widescreen, like a widescreen computer, for example. And so if you were to look at the contrast between those two types of people and their kind of daily activity, would you also then get people that have this kind of enlarged screen use, would they then have a stronger effect based on the laterality?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you so much for bringing this up. I think you are talking about how wide is our mental space. So basically, if we are using a larger screen, we will have a larger mental space and we will decode it like more widely and we will get the effect more strongly.
Yeah, so it's based on practice though. So the idea that is embedded in the working memory, that kind of use. So it's, yeah.
That's a very interesting question. I think we are at the start point in our lab to do some experiments on this issue, but I don't have an explicit answer to your question yet.
Okay, good, thanks.
Well, thank you so much.
More questions? Faisal, I was wondering to what extent your participants were monolingual Farsi, or did they have experience with left-right writing languages?
That's a very interesting question as well. I tried to use the ones that use Farsi in their daily lives to read and write and to talk, to speak. But of course, they were all university students, so they are definitely familiar with Latin languages or left to right languages. Some of them were like, in one of them I explicitly saw that he was a programmer, and I could see that the slope was not increasing, it was decreasing. So I think rather than considering only language as the factor which influences this right to left organization, there are other factors that we should consider, but generally speaking, this was the result.
Mm-hmm. So it could be interesting to test those participants with, let's say, English words or alphabetic letters, and then see what happens and to what extent their language context is important.
That would be really interesting. Same
There's time for one final question. And if there's no question, then we proceed to the next speaker, who is Jean-Philippe van Dijk. And he will tell us about spatial patterning in working memory and how it can be a determinant for mathematical proficiency. Jean-Philippe. Yeah, that's the correct screen.
Okay,
Philippe, your voice.
Yeah. Now does it works?
Yeah, but now we don't have the good. Yeah, okay.
Good. All right. Fantastic. So good morning, everybody. I'm going to present a study from a more applied or a more practical point of view. So we spoke about, Faisal and Julia spoke about spatial patterning in working memory. So the use of space in order to get a grip of the serial order of a sequence. And here we ask the question, to what degree spatial patterning as a more general idea can be seen as a determinant or can be used as a determinant for mathematical abilities. Now, it is already known for quite a long time that spatial thinking plays a fundamental role in the way how people perceive and conduct mathematics. From an intuitive point of view, I think most of us You can find some examples where we use space if we want to solve some mathematical issues, but also great mathematicians like Einstein and Poincaré, for example, explicitly stated that they used visual images, mental imagery, when they solved complex mathematical issues. So at this moment in the literature, the point is that it is established the link between spatial thinking, spatial processing and mathematics. There are many examples, empirical examples that show a strong link between the two concepts. So at this point, the question is not anymore, does there exist a link between spatial thinking and mathematics, but rather how can we explain the link? Why is there a link between spatial skills and mathematics? Now, recently a couple of accounts are proposed to explain the link. They are not, that's important to stress, they are not mutual exclusive. So it is possible that depending on the situation, on the context, it can be one or a mixture of these different accounts that can help to explain the link. And one of those accounts is the idea that numbers are in itself, the meaning of numbers are itself spatially represented, and that the idea that the mental representation of numbers is spatial in nature, takes the shape of a mental number line, which is organized according to our reading habits, and here in the West with small items, small numbers associated with the left side of this mental number line, large numbers with the right side. And that because space is so inherently associated with number representation, from there it's easy to predict that spatial processes, or that those who are good in spatial processes probably also have a better number representation and are therefore better in mathematics. And this can explain the link. Now, a second account starts from a neural point of view, and there are many neuroimaging studies showing that performing mathematics, working numbers, processing numbers activate partly overlapping brain areas with those that are activated when solving space-related tasks, and mainly in the intraparietal sulcus and parietal area surrounding it. Those are shared by both space and number processing, and the idea is that if you have a well-developed neural network for one domain, that also the other domain benefits from it. But this does not necessarily mean that there is, at least at the cognitive level, a functional link between the two. Now, the third and the fourth account are slightly overlapping, and the idea with the third account is that we can use spatial visualization, that we can make spatial models when we perform certain mathematical tasks. For example, when we perform word problems, that we can put the different elements of the word problem on a kind of mental whiteboard, and that by bringing them into relation to each other, these different elements, that this can be helpful to solve the problem. This can also be used in geometry. The idea is that you have a kind of mental whiteboard or a blackboard, whatever you want to call it, and that you can use this mental whiteboard in order to put your different elements that are needed to solve the mathematical problem, and therefore it can be useful. Now, this is partly overlapping with the idea that working memory, and especially spatial working memory, can be involved. And the idea is that maybe this mental whiteboard is an instance or is a specific aspect of visual spatial working memory. Some studies find evidence for the idea that there is a kind of overlap. Other people find evidence that it is spatial working memory, visual spatial working memory is somehow distinct and contributes to other aspects than this visual modeling or the spatial modeling idea. But anyway, there is conceptually a kind of overlap between the two. And then the idea is that visual spatial working memory can also be helpful in order to keep track of your the different things that you need to compute, to calculate, to manipulate in order to solve the mathematical problem. Now, it is important to stress that those four accounts are not necessarily mutually exclusive, so that probably depending on what kind of problem you need to solve, that maybe sometimes it's more related to the spatial representation of numbers, and sometimes it's more beneficial to use visual spatial modeling to solve the problem, and so on. So that probably it's a mixture between the four. Good. Now, in the present study, we will conduct behavioral studies a couple of behavioral experiments where we tried to link the first, the third, and the fourth account and to test them separately. Now, in the first study, we mainly focus on this spatial number representation account and to see whether there is a link between the spatial representation of numbers and mathematics. And in study 2, we test a hybrid account, which is partly in between the spatial modeling and this working memory account. And there we start from the links that are already discussed in the symposium today between the spatial patterning in verbal working memory and the fact that you associate verbal serial order to space, and to see to what degree it links to mathematical abilities. Now, in the first study, we measured the spatial representation of numbers using the snark effect. So the snark effect is an index of this spatial mental representation of numbers, which is very easy to administer and quite easy to calculate. So the idea is that you ask participants to perform a parity judgment task on digits ranging from 1 to 9, with and asking them to give left and right-handed responses. And what you typically see that small numbers are responded to faster with the left hand, large numbers with the right hand. Now, when you calculate differences in reaction time, so when you subtract the left reaction time from the left hand from the right hand, for each number, you can see something which you see on the graph here below on the figure, that these DRTs go down, that the DRTs become more negative the further you go into the sequence. Now, when you calculate the slope of this regression line, then you have an index to what degree someone associates numbers to space. So, and the more negative the slope, the stronger the association is. Now, the link between the snark effect and mathematical abilities is already studied quite a lot in the past, but the results are unclear. Many null results, both in children and in adults, and if there are effects, they are typically weak. Only in one case, the correlation is above 0.30. It is often investigated and observed in extreme groups, children with mathematical disabilities, of problems, or adults that are really professional mathematicians, so typically not within the normal range. And the strange thing is, when those results are found, they are the direction goes in opposite direction for children and for adults. So in children, you see the stronger someone's snark effect, the better he or she is in mathematics, while in adults you find the opposite effect. Now, so if you take everything together and say, good, many studies investigate special groups. It's another problem with those studies is that very often the reliability of both the snark effect, the snark task, and the math tasks is not always reported, and if it is reported, it's not always optimal. And it is important, if you want to investigate correlations, that the reliability of your measurements is okay. Then we recently found that although you can have a snark effect at the group level, that not all individuals show a consistent snark effect, and it's unclear whether it's important to look to the individual consistency to see whether an individual links numbers to space, and to consider this within the correlation, yes or no. And this information is also typically not given in these studies. And then finally, in many of the studies, they use mental arithmetic as a measure of mathematics, and they did not consider mathematics in the broad sense. But it's reasonable to believe that maybe not all mathematical domains are equally strongly linked to spatial processes. For example, it's undoubtedly that geometry strongly drives upon spatial processes, but it is not so sure whether addition or subtraction, for example, uses this. Word problems, what about fractions? So therefore, I think it's interesting to consider mathematics as a broader construct, and then to see whether there are relations between spatial abilities and those different mathematical abilities. So in this study, we conducted 4 experiments where we differentially try to boost the reliability of our measurements to be sure that the reliability of both the SNARK task and the MAT tasks are fine, that there is enough heterogeneity in the groups, and that we have mathematics, that we consider mathematics in a broad sense. So in study 1, we increased the reliability by boosting the amount of repetitions in our measurement. In experiment 2, we also boosted the reliability by increasing the amount of measurements per condition, but we checked a heterogeneous sample, so not students, but people from 18 till 85 years old with different backgrounds in terms of education. Then in experiment 3, we added, besides speeded arithmetic, a curriculum-based math tests with many trials per condition, and then finally we combined both the curriculum-based math test and the speeded arithmetic with enough measurements per condition to get to see the full picture. Now, first of all, we checked the reliability, and both for the SNARK tasks as for the math tasks, the reliability was sufficient, was good. And we also checked for the consistency, at the individual level. So we saw that 60 to 83% of the individuals that participated in the studies showed a SNARK effect at the individual level. So from there we can say that at the group, the effect is for sure there. Now, when we look to the 4 experiments, when we calculated the kind of overall math measurements, we didn't see any correlation between the SNARK effect, the size of the SNARK effect, and this overall math score. But also when we looked to the individual math subtasks, we couldn't find any relationship. Then we looked to those people, then we restricted our analysis, the correlations, to those people who consistently showed a SNARK effect at the individual level. And again, also for those who showed the effect individually, there was no correlation. And finally, we also checked the correlation for those people that linked numbers to space in a left to right manner, because some individuals also showed it in the opposite direction. And again, there was no correlation. And then finally, we looked to the scatter plots to see whether the lack of correlations was not due to nonlinear relationships or the presence of outliers. And as you can see over here, there really doesn't seem to be any kind of relationship. So I think from those studies, it's clear to say there is no link between the SNARK effect, between the spatial representation of numbers measured in an implicit manner and the tested mathematical abilities. It is not due to limited reliability, not due to inconsistency at the level of the individual, and not due to small sample sizes. Good. So then the next question is, okay, good. SNARK, it doesn't seem to be the spatial representation of numbers. So what about spatial?
You have 3 minutes.
Okay, yeah, but that will work. So what about the spatial representation in working memory? So we used a task where we can measure whether serial order is mapped in a left-right manner. And now again with the same math tasks, and now we did find a correlation with with the overall math score, and then with a couple of different subtasks. And here the stronger people use space or map information from left to right, the better people are in mathematics. Then we checked to those people who consistently show the effect. And here we had 3 groups: people that did not map serial order to space in a consistent manner, people that did it consistently from left to right, and people who did it consistently from right to left. And what we saw, that the people who mapped from left to right, it's not just the use of space, but the use of space according to our reading habits, that those people are more than half a standard deviation better in mathematics compared to the people who did not show the effect consistently. Finally, to get a more deeper grip on what exactly is happening there, we also checked these 3 groups for their working memory span, their working memory capacity, and we saw that people who map from left to right also are better in maintaining information in working memory, and are better to judge the order of digits, so also order processing. If you organize your memory from left to right, the people are better in it. So to conclude, Structuring working memory in a spatial manner can be helpful in performing mathematics. It seems to be a general effect, but it is a bit more pronounced for word problems and fractions. And it seems to be that the coding from left to right and not just a spatial coding in general, because people who do it from left to right benefit more from it than the other group. And it seems to be linked to an optimal functioning of order coding in working memory. So thanks a lot for your attention.
Time for questions. I see that one question came in from Wim Gevers.
Yes, Jean-Philippe.
Yes.
I had a small question, is that didn't you once show that there was a relation or a correlation between the snark effect and your serial order task, where you suggested that both of them have a same kind of origin? And if that's the case, then how do you explain the dissociation that you present here towards mathematics?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we have to revise this this idea that both are driving upon the exactly of is an example of the same coding, underlying coding mechanisms. There is something shared, but I think we have to revise the idea that it is completely the same mechanism. I agree, yeah, but I think that you also showed something empirically that goes in that direction, of that support this idea.
Thank you.
Other questions? I don't think so. I don't see anything in the chat.
Well, I
No.
have one, if possible.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Well, Jean-Philippe, based on the results of your study, do you have any idea whether training children on spatial organization of information in working memory could be helpful for academic achievement, or do you think that this is the connection is a little bit too small here?
Yeah, I think this will be an important step to show the causal link between the two. If you can indeed show that with training, the way how you organize your memory, and I think this is an interesting way to look at it. It's not just trying to, like in the past, they did some mental number line training, and by letting children dance on a specific dance mat to see in and to associate small numbers with left, large numbers with right, and then it had some effects, but it did not generalize to many mathematical domains. I think here, if you can indeed train children in organizing and structuring their working memory, and to put really different items on different positions in space, that this can be helpful, or at least the idea is something which can be used by speech therapists who train children with math difficulties, and therefore, yeah, both theoretically, I think it's interesting to see whether there is a causal link, and second, if it is and if it works, and I think the framework and the idea behind it makes it promising, then it is indeed something which can be applied in the clinical practice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because the advantage of this kind of training is that it's training of a strategy.
Yeah.
And this is probably one of the only things that really works at the developmental level. Because many studies have shown that general working memory capacity training in children does not really lead to reliable results. But the only studies showing some effects are studies based really on strategy learning. And so it could be very interesting here indeed whether this kind of spatial strategy both improve its working memory, well, the efficiency of working memory processing, and whether this then indeed generalizes to academic achievement.
Yeah, that's a nice idea. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
If there is no further questions, then we are going to close this symposium. I want to thank all of you attendants for being there online. Of course, we hope that next time it will be in real life again. I also want to thank the organizers for allowing us to organize this symposium here, despite the difficulty that comes with these online presentations. And I think it would be now that it's almost 12 o'clock, it would be interesting if you could attend the BAPS Prize Award ceremony, of which you can find the link in the chat or also via the website. So see you next time, and thanks for your participation. Bye-bye.